Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my guest for the second time today, this evening, as a part of a live stream, Jared Taylor, great Jared Taylor. Jared Taylor, you're here for the second time for because of the public demand. Also, you were my best watched video. We had 30,000 views of our interview and near 1,000 commentaries and so forth. Uh, Dear Jared Taylor, thank you for accepting my second invitation, and I hope
Oh,
people will enjoy uh, our interview.
well, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I won't disappoint your viewers.
I'm sure you won't. I'm sure you won't. Uh, First thing I would like to talk about you with you is your Schengen ban.
Mm.
Um, what happened? What is your interpretation of it? Because it got really odd. What was odd about it? What was the most odd about it was not that you got banned from Schengen, but that it was Poland that did it. What's odd about this is that Poland was supposed to be some sort of one of the last beacons of right wingism, conservatism, traditional Catholicism, even nationalism in Europe. And this is what's the most odd about it. What's your explanation? Uh,
I can tell you everything that I know. Unfortunately, there's a great deal that I do not know. All I can tell you is that about 2 years ago, when I was changing planes in Zurich, expecting to go to Stockholm, I was called aside by the immigration authorities and they put me in a small room and they interrogated me for some time, not in an unfriendly way, just trying to get information from me. And then they told me that I was banned from Schengen. And I had never gotten a notice from anyone that I was banned. And I discovered that it was Poland who had put out the ban. And although Switzerland, Zurich, is not part of the Schengen area, they respect Schengen regulations. So I was not able to go through and catch my connecting flight to Stockholm. So I spent the night in the airport. The airline it was forced to put me up in a kind of a dormitory, a very strange little area with bunk beds, and everyone had a kind of a communal place. I'm sure it's very inexpensive, but they put me up there and then flew me back to the United States. Well, why was I banned? That is a very curious thing. And I can't tell you how many hours trying to find out what was the reason so that I could appeal this ban. I not only did I contact the Polish embassy here in the United States, I contacted the Polish immigration authorities in Warsaw, and I translated some documents into Polish and sent them various places. I never got any kind of reply. I even spoke to the United States State Department and I said, look, I'm an American citizen. Here is Poland that has banned me from 28 countries. Is there anything that you, as my representative to foreign countries, can do about that? And the State Department said to me, if that's Poland's determination, we can do nothing about it. I don't know if that's true or not. I suspect that it had to do with the fact that they, in particular, don't like me. If I were a gay activist or if I were some sort of Black Lives Matter fanatic, they probably would have gone to bat for me and tried to get this Schengen ban overturned. But since the American authorities don't like me any more than the Polish authorities do, they did nothing. So, what was the source of this ban? I later learned from some of my comrades in Poland that when I was invited to speak to several Polish groups, nationalist groups, there's a group in particular called All Polish Youth. I spoke to several rather small gatherings, maybe no more than 30, 40, 50 people. But the organizers determined that there was a spy in their midst who was working for the Polish authorities, the Polish police. And it's their impression that they told the Polish police that I was some sort of horrible Nazi, that I wanted to establish a totalitarian system throughout the world. And for that reason, I should be banned. Now, my friends in Poland who organized my speaking tour, they figured that he was just trying to curry favor with the authorities for whatever reason. He has since been banished from their group, but it is true that to the extent that I got any explanation about my ban at all, it was from the police in Zurich, the Border Patrol. Excuse me. And they said that the Polish authorities thought that I was going to be spreading a totalitarian ideology. So that fits in with what my friends in Poland later explained that they had discovered. But it was a 3-year ban, as I understand it, although some of the details are sketchy. And my understanding is that I am banned from the entire Schengen group until September of next year. So now it's slightly less than 1 year, and then I can go back to Europe. So that is my current situation. I'm also, by the way, banned from Great Britain. The British at least had the good manners to inform me ahead of time. They said, don't bother trying to come to the kingdom because we will turn you back at the border. Now, this is of particular concern to me. This has gone on for nearly 4 years now. The British ban preceded my Schengen ban. But I have a daughter who is going to university in Great Britain now. And so I wrote to the British authorities and I said, would you let me come and see my daughter? And they acknowledged my request, but then they said, we will let you know if there's any change in your status. That was maybe 2 or 3 months ago. I've not heard from them. So I take that to mean that I am still banned from Britain indefinitely in the case of Britain. So despite the fact that I am almost exclusively of British blood, with a little bit of French Huguenot, a little bit of Dutch here and there, I'm almost wholly British Isles, but I cannot go back to the land of my forefathers, despite the fact that, as you know, there are all sorts of Muslim fanatics and cutthroats who are apparently welcome in Britain, all sorts of people who hate Europe. So this is the great irony. The European authorities, both the Schengen authorities and Great Britain, seem to be perfectly prepared to welcome people who hate Europe, hate our culture, hate Western civilization. But someone like me, who is a true lover of our civilization, our people, our culture, I am banned. So how's this going to end? I don't know. I suspect at some point next year, I will travel back to Europe, back to the Schengen group, and we will see if the ban has in fact been lifted. I certainly hope so.
Do you think that this is the effect of media, or is the greater effect is this the greater effect of some secret, more or less secret foundations that are working behind, like Soros Foundation or something like that, or is it that these people are just so misinformed about what you propagate, about what your thought is, about what were your books about, what your books are about, and so forth? What's your opinion on this?
I think in the case of Poland, it is certainly the latter. They are very misinformed. And if they had a contact in one of the groups for which I was supposed to be speaking that said, oh, this guy is a committed Nazi and he walks around and he Sieg Heils and he goose steps and he's a Hitler worshiper, I suppose they just didn't take the trouble to investigate what it is I really do and think. So, and on the subject of Poland as being one of these nationalist places that we like to think we can trust, in a way, I think that makes Poland more vulnerable. They are constantly being berated by Angela Merkel and the Western part of the European Union for not taking in Muslims, for not welcoming Africans. They're being told that they're wicked, racist, and fascist. And so I think for that reason, they feel as though they have to make gestures and protect themselves. You may remember that I guess it was back in 2014, there was a nationalist conference that was put together by an American named Richard Spencer. Yeah. And the assumption was that the Hungarians would welcome this kind of meeting. But they kicked everyone out. They canceled the conference. And so I think that in a way, they feel a particular kind of pressure not to appear to be doing anything that's really out of line. So that is my perhaps excessively generous explanation as to what happened in Poland. In the case of the United Kingdom, when the authorities, the British Home Office, at the time it was directed by Theresa May, who later became Prime Minister. And so I was written not exactly by her, but in her name. So I got this letter in the name of Theresa May. She excerpted a number of comments that I had made or things that had been written about me, more or less accurate. The comments that I had made are ones that I had said. And they said, well, this kind of statement is unwelcome in the United Kingdom, and we have no reason to believe that if you were to come to the United Kingdom, that you would refrain from making statements of this kind. And so those were the reasons they gave. And I don't believe there was any kind of particular pressure on them. I just don't know what their procedures are. At that time, they were issuing bans of this kind against a number of Americans. The Black nationalist Louis Farrakhan is subject to a ban. There's also an American radio broadcaster named Michael Savage who has been banned. There are a number of people who they just decided to ban at that time. So I don't really know what goes on behind the scenes for something like that. All I know is that I am banned. And I would like, as I say, to be able to visit my daughter, who is a university student there now. But for the time being, I cannot. I've thought about writing to them and saying, well, I promise not to go to any meetings. I promise not to do anything. This will strictly be a private visit, and see if they will accept me under those circumstances. But we'll see. But again, I find it shocking and insulting that I, who am mostly British and who love our heritage and culture, am banned from Britain while they accept all sorts of people who are the very opposite.
Maybe you would come to campus, and then white British Anglo-Saxon students could see you, and then they would energize themselves and gather and attack all the Muslims and colored people. Maybe this is the danger.
I'm sure that's what they imagined, that all I would have to do is set foot on campus, and then all of a sudden these otherwise well-behaving white people would rise up in a fury, and they would start a pogrom, or they would turn into SS troops, and they would go rampaging through the campus doing all sorts of horrible things. All I have to do is set foot on campus, and this would happen. Who knows what they think? It is really quite preposterous. As I say, I would love to be able to sit down and to just have a frank conversation with the people who make these decisions. But that is an opportunity that is certainly likely to be denied to me.
I did ask you something about this question in our first interview about your interviews for you had 2 interviews for CNN, if I'm not wrong. Correct me if I'm not wrong. What was how did people react to this interviews? I don't mean right-wingers, nationalists, conservatives, and so forth. How did people? What were the commentaries like when you did that 2 interviews for CNN?
Unfortunately, I can't really tell you what ordinary Americans thought about those interviews. When CNN itself broadcasts things like that, they chop my comments up into little snippets, whereas what we do is we record the whole thing, and then we're able to put it up on our website, which I think is the only fair way to operate. These days, I won't accept an interview, a recorded interview, unless we can record the whole thing. I just am not going to bother. On the one hand, we have discovered that even if I appear on CNN or NBC or some quite large American broadcaster, or if I'm interviewed for a large newspaper like the Washington Post, the New York Times, it doesn't really bring any traffic, or hardly any traffic at all, to our website. So there's really no advantage in appealing to a broader audience in that respect. What we do find useful, though, is to have the entire conversation available to people who are interested, and people who react very well to that kind of thing. one of the videos that we put up, we now have our videos on BitChute because, well, for reasons I won't get into, because you still have the larger audience here. One of the videos we recently put up was an interview with an Israeli journalist. And he was quite persistent in trying to undermine my position. I think that I was very successful in explaining how he was suffering from a terrible double standard that will ultimately lead to the oblivion of our people. And that has been a very popular thing as well. Many people who already agree with us, and then of course people who have an open mind, who are willing to hear both sides of a conversation, they're attracted to longer conversations like that because they're not restricted simply to just a few snippets or a slogan. But again, I wish I could give you a sense of how ordinary people react. The only way that I can tell you is that we do get frequent messages from people who write into the American Renaissance website and say Jared Taylor's interviews or his essays or his podcasts have been something that opened my eyes. So I'm very glad about that. And I try to be extremely reasonable and never draw any conclusions that are not warranted by the facts. And I think that is extremely important if we're trying to attract people who may already be skeptical. Most people who do not already agree with us, they will listen to someone like you or me, and they are just looking for any excuse to say, oh, this guy's a fool. This guy's motivated by all sorts of foul motives. He's unhinged. They're looking for some excuse not to pay any attention to any facts that you may be discussing. So for that reason, I believe it's very important to be as normal, as reasonable, and as plausible as possible. And that's what that's the tone that I always attempt to strike. Not that it's any particular effort on my part. I just tell them exactly what I think, but it's very important not to get excited, lose your temper, even though sometimes they repeat the same questions or they will come at you in a way that makes it clear that they have utterly failed to understand what you said before, which means that it's a real test of patience to have to try to explain something that you think you explained in an utterly unmistakable way.
We will put the link to your BitChute interview with the Israeli journalist after the video that people can watch it. I'm also interested in watching it. Do you think that this Israeli journalist was a left-wing journalist, or how was your conversation going on? Because I often see that for example, conservative or right-wing or ethno-nationalistic journalists from Israel do understand and can understand our positions, for example. So how was your conversation? What was his problem with your positions, or was he also misinformed about what you propagate?
I would not say that he was misinformed, but he is thoroughly convinced that it is legitimate to have a double standard. In other words, Jews can have a homeland. The Japanese can have a homeland. The Turks can have a homeland, but Europeans cannot. He came, essentially, that is what he said. And I said, well, why? He said, because of the Holocaust. That's always the answer they come up with. I said, well, for heaven's sake, when this happened 70, 80 years ago, and why is it that to this day, why is it that Europe cannot repay? Why is it that Europe must become invaded by Africans and Muslims because of something that one German regime did before you and I were even born? What accounts for this? Do you think we have hereditary guilt? Are white Europeans, are we especially likely to be wicked? If that's the case, shouldn't we all be exterminated? He really had no good answer. And it's very peculiar because there seems to be a kind of Jewish nationalist that is utterly incapable of realizing that the same rules that should apply to Jewish nationalism should, of course, apply to any kind of European nationalism. And he kept coming back to this over and over and over again in ways that showed me that he certainly believed what he was thinking, but he had just never made the slightest attempt to try to understand a European point of view. All he can think about is Holocaust, Holocaust, Holocaust. And that explains why Europeans must never have a consciousness of race, no matter where they live, whether they're in Australia or New Zealand, not just the Germans, all white people everywhere. It's really a kind of pathetic short-sightedness, a pathetic sort of self-absorption about all that matters is our people, the Jews. And if white people misbehaved to our people, the Jews, then that means all white people everywhere could potentially misbehave in the same way. So they are not allowed to have nations that reflect their genetic and cultural heritage. It's really as simple as that. And so it's very easy to argue in a way that makes someone who's taking that position look ridiculous. On the other hand, as you say, there are Jewish nationalists who recognize that our sentiments are very much the mirror image of their own, or that they are entirely congruent with a similar sense of wanting your nation to reflect your genes, your family, your tribe, your heritage. And so they're very sympathetic. But I don't find that there are very many such Israelis.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't made the survey, but you have to give this to Dr. E. Michael Jones. There is a point that he makes that makes sense if you take this conversation into consideration. For example, if you take the white identity apart and you say that there are only ethnical identities and religious identities, then they don't have this white card to use against us anymore. For example, yet I do admit that this does that from this it does not follow that white identity does not exist. If they use this card against us and they use it really rhetorically vicious, this does not mean that there is no white identity, for example.
No, it is true. For Europeans, I think it is much easier to be a Flemish nationalist, for example, rather than a racial nationalist. You can say, we want Flanders to be Flemish. Slovenians can say, we want Slovenia to be for Slovenians, Hungary for the Hungarians. All of that's easier to say than we have the right to remain white. Now, I think that Europeans as a whole have the right to say not only is Hungary for the Hungarians, but that if we're to have an immigration policy and we wish to admit people from any other part of the world, we're going to limit it to Europeans because they are our racial cousins. I think that is entirely legitimate. Of course, that would be considered Nazi behavior by contemporary standards. So that is one way that people who I believe are in fact very, very well aware of the racial problem get around that sort of "you are Nazis" attitude by saying we are ethnic nationalists and not racial nationalists. That's fine. However, what about the United States? Here, it would be very difficult to start a movement saying, okay, we are Anglo-Saxons. We're going to have Anglo-Saxon nationalism. Is that supposed to mean that German Americans or Italian Americans, Irish Americans, they're supposed to be excluded from this? No, not at all. The way that people align in the United States is very much along racial lines. If you were living in the United States, no racially conscious white person would say, no, he's Eastern European. He just doesn't count. No one thinks in those terms. And I think at the larger level, not just in the United States, but in the entire globe, we must think in terms of a world brotherhood of Europeans. Why is it that you're interviewing me? I'm not the same ethnicity as you, but it's because we in America and you, we all face the same problems of dispossession. We all face the same problems of an attempt to delegitimize any attempt to preserve our culture and our heritage. So we and the Canadians, we and the Romanians, the Germans, we're all in the same boat. And for that reason, although up until the mid-20th century, Europeans were slaughtering each other in terrible, really wars of brothers, we, I think, gradually, and well, in some cases, really quite rapidly, have completely set that aside, and we can work together as Europeans wherever we are, and that is an essential way to proceed.
There's certainly the lootings, the acts of the so-called Black Lives Matter groups, the Antifa groups. What's happening now in America? This is obviously an evidence that people that are against us don't care about our ethnical identities. They are basically against white people. And this is all. Although I did hear this from Vox Day, if and I would ask you to comment on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong. If anybody knows the Vox Day's position better than me, he said once that Anglo-Saxons are that have modern Anglo-Saxons in America that have Anglo-Saxon ancestors that were the part of the original population of Americans. These are basically the only real Americans. So the Anglo-Saxon Americans are the real Americans. They are the only ones that count as real Americans, because all the ethnicities that came later on are migrants or were migrants or I think this was his position.
Well, I can't claim to be an expert on what Vox Day thinks really about anything. I would certainly disagree. There's no doubt about it that it was Anglo-Saxons who built the country, established its institutions, gave it its language, gave it its religion. All of these things are really based very deeply in English common law, in the British ideas of the rights of the citizen. That is all true. And if you look at the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, there's maybe a Dutch name, or the people who fought in the Revolution. There were a few Gildersleeves and names like that. Kosciuszko, but this Polish officer who fought for the Revolution. The vast majority were of English descent. And that is my heritage as well. The first tailor came to the colonies in 1635. I'm about as deeply rooted in North America as anyone can possibly be. And so, yes, it is my people who established the country. On the other hand, when Europeans came here, it didn't take them very long, maybe one or two, maybe three generations, to become indistinguishable in terms of income, in terms of likelihood to marry other Europeans, in terms of likelihood to go to college. They became Americans in a full-fledged way. And to say somehow that it is only the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons who are the true Americans, I think that's a narrow and unfortunate view. As I said earlier, if we are to defend ourselves, it will be not as Anglo-Saxons, it will be as white people. And that is the way that we are perceived by people who want to change the country and to reduce our influence essentially to nothing. It's not that people will say, oh, he's an Italian American. He's a good guy. That guy, though, he's a WASP. He's got to go. No, they don't think in those terms at all. They think of us as white people. They think of us as the oppressors. It makes no difference. Look at Columbus, for heaven's sake. Columbus is now one of the most hated people in American history because he brought Europeans to the United States. He wasn't an Anglo-Saxon. He was an Italian. He was working for the court of Spain. And to say somehow that only the Anglo-Saxons are the real Americans. No, nobody who wants America to change in ways that go directly against our interests thinks in those terms at all. And not only do they not think in those terms, I think for us as well, it's not at all fruitful to think that way. We need all the allies we can get, for heaven's sake. And to say, oh, you're Irish. No, you're not on our side. That would be insane in my view.
Before I forget, I have to ask you some questions. The commentators and the viewers wrote. Rafael Ramirez wrote, "Please ask Mr. Taylor about his opinion on Spanish Catholic fascism. Do you have an opinion about it?"
No, I really can't say that I do. I am deeply sympathetic to all conservative currents of thought. And I'm not Catholic, but I am deeply sympathetic also with people who are firm believers in the Catholic Church. As far as fascist organization is concerned, that is a historical phenomenon that involved a combination of how the church and the state and corporations all worked together, particularly as was in the case of Spain. I'm not at all a student of that period, but I would certainly agree that the Falange victory in the Spanish Civil War, I think I'm entirely in favor of that. The Republic, I think, would have been a miserable place. Whether any of that kind of thinking is applicable to the United States today or to Europe today, that's a separate matter. And I do not necessarily claim that it is applicable in any sense other than trying to maintain tradition and to base it in some kind of religious basis. I'm not at all opposed to that. On the other hand, to me, what is essential is not necessarily religion or being a pagan or being an atheist. To me, the essential thing is, are you aware that you are a white person and that as a white person, you have interests in common with other white people? You may have narrower interests in common with white people of your own language, your own ethnicity, but basically, so long as we can agree on the basic question, which is race, then we can solve other problems. We can work out compromises. I think it's a mistake, for example, to say, okay, well, a European ethno-state or an American white ethno-state is going to be based in Christianity, or it's going to be based in paganism, or we're going to completely exclude homosexuals. Well, no, a nation has all of these things. A nation, a true nation, has right, it has left, it has Christians, it has people who are not Christians. And so to be a true nation, we have to have something in common, but the something in common goes back to the original Latin origin of the word. I believe it's nacere, which means to be born. We share a common ancestry, and so long as we understand the importance of that ancestry, that is the main ingredient. Once people agree on that, then we can work things out. There are going to be some people in racially conscious white people who don't think that there should be the right to bear arms. There are those who are going to want a large government, small government. I don't care. All of these problems can be worked out. And it may be that the natural state of white people is a kind of Scandinavian socialism, or the natural state of certain white people may be a kind of rugged individualistic, almost libertarian state as we had in the United States up until maybe the mid part of the 20th century. I don't really care. Whatever works out for that group at that time, so long as we all agree on the basic thing, and the basic question is race.
Another viewer asked me a question a couple of minutes ago. It was about European Muslims. We had the European Muslims in ex-Yugoslavia, for example, Albanians and the so-called Bosniaki. These were Bosnian European Muslims, and the most important characteristic of these European Muslims was that they were very secularized. They weren't Muslims in the sense you know Muslims in the West, for example. Do you have any opinion on this European Muslims?
You know, it's a question that I wish I was more knowledgeable about. As you can imagine, it's not a problem that arises in the United States. For us, and for most of Western Europe, the Muslims are not white. And for that reason, as well as the kind of Islam they follow, makes them an indigestible, unassimilable group in either the United States or in Europe. So the fact of having Muslims per se is, we don't really often think in terms of European Muslims. I realize there is such a phenomenon, and I've never met such a person, but it seems to me that if Muslims, if Muslims really are secularized, if they do see the importance of race, that race comes first, I suppose that you could have a certain number of Muslims in a racially conscious European ethnostate. But again, this is not a subject about which I have any kind of specialized knowledge. I have very, very little even general knowledge about this, but it is something that I really should take the time to look into more seriously.
As we were preparing for the interview, I told you that I would like to clear some terms that are being used about you from the misinformed media. For example, I wrote that I read that someone wrote a book about you where he says that you were supposed to be the threat to liberal democracy, and I thought we could clear up a little bit these terms. What is liberal democracy, and what is it about what you propagate that could threaten the
Well, that's an excellent question. What do people mean by liberal democracy? People have said that Donald Trump is a potentially mortal threat to liberal democracy. Well, to me, this means a kind of democracy that may represent the will of the people, but does not represent their particular will. If it is democracy that recognizes, if the will of the people is one that recognizes a certain legitimacy of the racial interest of whites, then is that somehow no longer democracy? Or is it somehow no longer liberal democracy? To me, this is a way of drawing artificial lines and saying, okay, if you really do think that white people have legitimate interests, then as a political system itself, you're proposing something that is completely illegitimate. That doesn't make any sense at all. There's no reason in the world why Americans cannot vote in a government that restricts immigration or has an immigration preference only for Europeans, only for other white people. Is Israel, for example, is it not a liberal democracy in that sense? It restricts immigration only to Jews for the most part. Does that mean that it's a fascism, that it's a totalitarianism? Is it no longer a democracy? So no, this is a completely illegitimate way of trying to limit the choices that the people are allowed. And in other words, they're saying, okay, if the people are allowed to pick certain choices that we disapprove of, then democracy is over. This is unfair. It's completely wrong and foolish. And is it to say that the United States, which up until 1965 had an immigration policy that was designed to keep the country overwhelmingly white, was it not a democracy up until that point? This is just nuttiness. And again, it is a trick of language to say that somehow, if you disagree with me and your political choices are different from mine, then you are no longer part of democracy. That's utterly unfair and one-sided. I reject that idea completely. But the United States has been practicing this kind of this notion of what democracy should be for some time. I remember that. I can't remember how many years ago, maybe 20 years ago or more, in Algeria, there was an election in which the FIS, the Front Islamique de Salut, I guess you could call that the Islamic Salvation Front. It won an election. Well, the United States says, no, we can't have elections that result in and that give results of that kind. That's not democracy. Wait a minute. It is democracy. It's just an outcome that people don't like. It's like saying, okay, if Donald Trump wins a second term, this is a mortal threat to democracy. Well, wait a minute. If that's what the people choose, isn't democracy the choice of the people? So, no, this is a completely illegitimate and transparently partisan attempt simply to say that any choice that is different from mine is illegitimate.
The second term that's being used to defame you is that you're white supremacist. What would be a meaningful definition of a supremacist? It doesn't matter if he's white or Jewish or black. What would be a supremacist in your opinion?
The term white supremacist does have a historical existence. There were white supremacists. These are people who thought that white people should rule over people of other races. The idea that white people, Europeans, should go to Africa, colonize the Africans, and build their economies in ways that serve the interests of whites rather than blacks. You could call that white supremacist. Now, at the same time, many of those Europeans thought that they were doing the Africans a great favor by giving them infrastructure, establishing some kind of rules of governance, of establishing rules of public health, etc. But the idea of white people ruling over blacks, that to me is what white supremacy is. I don't know anyone who thinks that anymore. It is a historical term, but as far as contemporary whites, to say that identitarians in France are white supremacists, this is just cuckoo. It's as stupid, of course, as calling anyone you disagree with a fascist. And that's what the left does all the time. If you disagree, you're a fascist. All right, silly. But they get away with this nonsense because the people that they deal with and the mainstream press go along with this idiocy. Now, I can spend 20 or 30 minutes explaining to a reporter from the New York Times, the Washington Post, why it is completely historically and semantically incorrect to call me a white supremacist. And it makes no difference. They'll call me a white supremacist anyway. The other argument you could make is that a white supremacist thinks that white people are superior to all other races. I certainly don't think that either. I think certainly in athletics, Africans in some respects are superior to whites. As far as average IQ is concerned, it's pretty clear to me that East Asians have a higher average IQ than whites. So does that make me a yellow supremacist or a black supremacist when it comes to sports? The idea of supremacism, it is simply a way to try to give you a label that means that people, oh, we don't have to take him seriously. He's a white supremacist. And this knowledgeable person writing from the New York Times says so. So that's all we need to know about this guy. Now, once again, it's dishonest, it's cowardly, it's a refusal to grapple with our ideas. And that I find utterly contemptible.
A viewer had a great comment about this white supremacy etiquette. He wrote that even Stéphane Molyneux is considered a white supremacist on Wikipedia. And he's hardly okay. He did speak about IQ, the differences in IQ in the past. You probably spoke with him too about
Yes.
this. But how can he, a anarcho-capitalist libertarian, be a white supremacist? This makes really no sense.
As well, to me, when the left uses the term white supremacist, they have two ideas in mind. One is that if you say that white people, on average, are more intelligent than black people, that makes you a white supremacist. And it makes no difference if you say, well, hold on, Ashkenazi Jews are the smartest people in the world, and East Asians are smarter than white people. Does that make you a Jewish supremacist? No, it doesn't make any difference. They still say, oh, he's a white supremacist. He thinks that white people on average are smarter than black people. That makes you a white supremacist. That's all it takes. The other is to say, okay, I, as a European, I prefer the society that Europeans make. I like our culture. I want my nation to reflect our culture, and I want my nation to have a supermajority of people like myself. Oh, that makes you a white supremacist. Well, okay. Does that mean that if the Turks want Turkey to be Turkish, does that make them Turkish supremacists? No one even thinks in those terms. This is a form of insult and an attempt to delegitimize only white people. Only white people. And as I say, I can talk myself blue in the face trying to explain these things to some liberal journalists. It's as if their ears are filled with wax. It doesn't make any difference. They still want to call you a white supremacist because that is their most insulting term. It used to be that calling someone was a racist was bad enough. No, that's not good enough. Too many people are called a racist. So you got to call us white supremacists. Oh my gosh. And that really makes you evil. I think they love calling you that because they like to associate that with slavery of the idea that white people were going to enslave blacks. You could call that a white supremacist institution. Jim Crow, the idea that blacks were excluded from certain jobs, no matter how competent they were at them, but they couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. You could call that white supremacist, yes. Nobody wants that. Nobody's advocating for that. But the idea is to call me or you or any person who says sensible things about race, like Stefan Molyneux, a white supremacist. The idea there is to hang this image of slavery, of lynching, of Jim Crow around our necks. It's completely unfair. It's utterly transparent, but they get away with it because nobody ever contests that. And as I say, you can contest it until you're blue in the face, and it will absolutely have no effect.
The terms racism or racist and race realist, what are the differences? And there are, I saw some intelligent liberal journalists that do make this difference, that do understand this difference, but they always say that even race realists that are not racist are secretly racist.
Right. Well,
they dog whistle to real racists with the pointing out the differences in favor of whites.
Well, race realists, they talk about racial differences, whether or not they're in favor, whether or not whites come out on top or not. It was white people who, with their IQ tests, determined that East Asians were on average smarter than they were. It's not the Asians who figured that out. And a white person, I don't care either way. It doesn't mean because Asians are smarter than my people that I wish to be replaced by them. Not at all. And no one would argue that just because white people on average are more intelligent than Haitians, that we should invade Haiti and kick all the Haitians out of Haiti. No one makes that argument. No one is saying that because Haiti has contributed nothing to world culture that somehow doesn't deserve to exist. I believe in real diversity, and real diversity is the source of differences, and let those differences last as long as they can. But no, this idea of somehow of supremacy, it's nutty. Now, to me, I reject the word racism. For several reasons. One is that it doesn't mean anything. Often it just means anything that you say about race, whether it is objectively provable differences in crime rates by race. Oh, even to talk about that's racist. What does that mean? That's stupid. The facts cannot be racist. The facts are the facts. Or if you're even talking about biological differences between blacks and whites that result in blacks being better sprinters, for example. Oh, not allowed to talk about that either. Why is that? Because it's racist. No, this is silly. The other reason I reject the term racist is because it has a distinct aroma of immorality. If you're a racist, then you are taking a position that is not only mistaken factually or logically, it is a position that is immoral. Well, no, nothing that I say about race is by any stretch of the imagination immoral. I believe my views about race are in great conformity with everything we know about history, human nature, biology, genetics, and they are unimpeachably moral. So that is an important reason why I reject a term that is, first of all, largely meaningless, but also one that is meant to imply moral opprobrium.
Okay, let's go ahead.
If I may add one more point about this term race realist. One of the problems that we face is that those of us who understand race and talk about it in common sense terms are faced with a problem. What do we call ourselves? Now, the reason my earpiece keeps falling out. One of the reasons that we don't have a good term for what we think is because for centuries, people took what I believe about race absolutely for granted. Everyone up until about John Kennedy's time in the United States understood that the races were different. They understood that whites had legitimate interests, and they could not imagine a United States that was not overwhelmingly European. That, to me, those are some of the elements of race realism. They realized that blacks on average were less intelligent than whites. They took it for granted. And that's why, because it was universally accepted, there was no particular word for people who took that point of view. They didn't need a word. It was like people who love their own children more than they love the children of strangers. We don't have a word for that because everybody thinks that way. And then all of a sudden, when in the 1950s and 1960s, it became popular to think that those who took the traditional common sense point of view were somehow wicked. And they invented this word racism, which didn't even exist until the 1930s. Then at that point, it became necessary to find a word that reflected the thinking of everyone up until at least the 1950s in the United States. There hadn't been a word because there'd been no need for a word. Were the founding fathers of the United States racist? Were the people who passed the very first immigration law into the United States to make sure that only free white persons of color could become naturalized citizens? Were they racist? The word didn't even exist. Well, what were they? They had no word for it because everyone agreed with them. As I say, it's like people who love their children. Now let's imagine a future dystopia in which the idea is that if you rear your own children, you may be giving them advantages that other children don't have. And so it is your obligation to give your children up for communally rearing in communal camps. And all of a sudden, if you resist that, then they've got a name for you, a bad name. You are a wicked familist. Well, okay, if familist means a bad person who wants to rear his own children, then what word would we come up with to describe the people who prefer to rear their own children? We don't have a word for that because we don't need it. It's taken for granted. And that is our problem, those of us who are racially conscious today, because we never needed a word for something that was obvious to everyone. The Europeans have a term, identitarian. That's a very good term, and it's being introduced into the English language. But the need for terms like that reflects the fact that we now are representing a point of view that was so common that there was no need for a word to describe it.
Let's go ahead towards some actual situations, happenings, events in America. What is your opinion on Black Lives Matter, on looting, on how Democratic Party acts benevolently towards this terroristic groups and organizations? What's your opinion on this situation in America?
Well, those are very big questions. To me, this latest series of riots has been different from any race riots in the history of the United States for a number of reasons. One is that you have thousands of white people who have joined in these actions and who have behaved as if they were aggrieved blacks. You never had in the famous Watch riots, Newark, New Jersey, or Detroit, you didn't have white people out there rioting, looting, burning, attacking the police. It never happened. And for whites to have swallowed this incredible nonsense that somehow all white people are racist, or all white people, unless they are actively fighting white supremacy, are somehow allies of white supremacy, supporting white supremacy, oppressing blacks simply by doing nothing. This is a new thing. All of those ideas were cuckoo ideas that started in the university, and I certainly did not expect them to come out into the general population the way they did. But for there to be literally thousands, maybe even millions of white Americans who believe that they are part of this dreadful, horrible, oppressive system, that's new. And for them to then join in all of this destructive behavior, wanting to attack the police, defund the police, all of this is new. Another thing that is new is that in the past, almost exclusively, when blacks rioted, they tore up their own neighborhoods. They did not move explicitly and specifically into white neighborhoods. And now in the United States, when you have places like Fifth Avenue in New York, when you have Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, when these places are being looted, this is very new. When you have rioters who are rampaging through white neighborhoods, and some of them beating on drums in the middle of the night and saying, wake up, motherfucker. All of this stuff is brand new. And frankly, despite the fact that I've spent 30 years carefully observing race relations in the United States, I did not expect to reach this point so quickly and so suddenly. And so before and after the death of George Floyd is a real turning point. Now, it did not have to be George Floyd. It could have been any number of different things that have set it off. But the ingredients for this insanity were clearly there. And we were beginning to see little bits of it during the riots in Ferguson. When was that? 2018? During also the riots in Baltimore. There were a few white anarchists and Antifa types on the fringes of those riots and the looting and the arson, but they were by no means a major part of it. Now, in cities like Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington, you find white people who are the majority of the rioters. This is something that is completely new. And to me, it's a form of mass insanity. And I don't know how we're going to solve this problem. On the other hand, the fact that these people have been so unreasonable, so violent, in some cases repeatedly rioting and looting and setting fires in places like Minneapolis, all of this is making more and more white people realize this is crazy, this is anti-white, this is not the America we thought we lived in, and people are really beginning to think seriously about what the future is going to bring. So these are very, very significant steps backward for the United States. 30 years ago, when I started American Renaissance, if you had told me that there are going to be white people running around spouting completely lunatic, idiotic slogans such as white silence is violence, the idea that if I say nothing, simply by saying nothing, I'm committing acts of violence against Black people, that this is insane. If you had told me that white people were going to be saying that, I wouldn't have believed you. I wouldn't have believed you. I might have put a gun to my head. I don't know. This is just such an astonishing mass lunacy, mass stupidity. But the dividing lines are becoming clearer and clearer in the United States. I don't believe that since the Civil War in the United States have people felt themselves so utterly alien from each other. And where this will go, I don't know. But this is a new development in modern times. And as I say, it's drawing the dividing lines ever so clearly. And if it comes time to choose up sides, it's very clear how the sides will sort themselves out. What the consequence of this will be, I can't predict, but they will not be agreeable.
What do you think is the function of Soros's Open Society Foundation? Soros is often used as a caricature, and people who use him as an explanation for leftist insanity are often being made fun of, as in the reality, the oligarchy behind it is much more complex. Soros is not the explanation for everything, and he probably isn't.
No.
How do you see him?
Well, nothing is the explanation for everything. There is no single cause. And I think some of the worst things that George Soros and his organizations have done in the United States is to get involved financially in a very significant way in campaigns for local district attorney, prosecutors. You're probably well aware that when you have an election for a prosecutor in a city, usually if somebody spends $100,000 on a campaign like that, that's a lot of money. So if George Soros gives one of his lefty pets $800,000 to spend, that's a huge amount of money. And the last time there are at least a dozen U.S. cities in which these prosecutors have been elected. And their role has been to not prosecute many of the crimes that they considered low level. And they made special attempts not to prosecute crimes of what they call poverty, which is supposed to affect non-whites more seriously than whites. Public defecation, loitering, shoplifting, all of these things, they're not considered, these are crimes of poverty. And so in San Francisco or Los Angeles, or increasingly in Chicago, to some degree in New York, these are not considered important crimes. Well, the quality of life deteriorates very, very rapidly. when you let people misbehave in ways like this. I think that is a very clearly palpable effect of the kind of nefarious effect that George Soros has. But those are easily traceable effects of spending a lot of money in a strategic way. As far as Black Lives Matter as a whole, BLM, it doesn't require George Soros. After these riots, more than $1 billion was pledged by American companies for Black Lives Matter and allied organizations. This isn't George Soros money. This is American corporate money. And I forgot to mention this, but another brand new thing about the rioting this time around is that if you loot a store, if you loot, for example, a Target department store, what does Target do? It pledges $10 million to Black organizations. It pledges to spend thousands of hours helping Black entrepreneurs get into business. What's this? No one ever did such a thing. No one ever did such a thing in previous riots. Another brand new effect is that when the rioting started, not only did people start taking down statues of statues of Confederates, they started taking down statues of Columbus, of George Washington. Back in the time of the Watts riots, of the Detroit riots, the riots in the 1960s, no one would have said, oh my gosh, the Negroes are acting up. We better take down statues of Columbus. You'd have been considered an absolute idiot to have said such a thing. And so this idea that when Black people riot, then not only do we have to tear down these statues, we are really erasing the entire history and culture of the United States. And on a smaller level, you have publications like the New York Times deciding, well, from now on, we're going to publicize the word Black, even if we don't publicize the word white. All of these changes in American society, they reflect, it's almost like the tulip panic in the Netherlands, or the witch trials in Salem in the 1600s. This is a kind of across-the-board insanity that very, very few people are willing to point out. All of this is new and very destructive. And I've forgotten the original question because I got distracted. So I apologize for the somewhat discursive answer.
No problem. I forgot it now too, and I already have another question for you, and I do think it's an important one, although it's probably not been researched enough till now. It's obviously that it's a quite big part of the problem is the fact that so many white people are being massively brainwashed. It wouldn't be so easy for Black Lives Matter and Antifa looters and thugs to rampage the whole country if so many whites weren't so brainwashed and cocked. You would probably agree with it. But are there any statistics, demographical statistics that show the ethnical structure of white people being brainwashed? For example, what is the percentage of Anglo-Saxons being brainwashed, the Americans of German ethnicity, and so forth and so forth?
I've never seen any polls about attitudes towards race that distinguished between Americans of British origin, Scandinavian origin, etc. And my guess is that those of Scandinavian origin are probably more liberal than those of British or German origin, but that's just a guess. Now, the original question had to do with George Soros. And let me briefly return to that before I get back to this question. I don't think that George Soros is nearly as important as people suggest. I think that his contributions to these elections of really very, very destructive district attorneys is a clear and traceable effect that he has. However, the number of people who are being brainwashed, and this is returning to your most recent question, this I don't think has much to do with George Soros as an individual at all. It has to do with a kind of thinking that started off in American college campuses. And I thought that it was going to pretty much stay there. But I guess if you take young people and you tell them over and over and over again that all white people are racist and only white people can be racist, that all white people have white privilege that's illegitimate, and that race is some sort of social construct, they'll end up believing this foolishness. So what are the number of people who think these crazy things? We do have historical trends about certain attitudes. One is, for example, whether people are in favor of mixed race marriage. And the number of Americans who say that they are in favor of it increases all the time. And we also have statistics on the number of Americans who say that they do not believe that genes have any effect on racial differences in achievement. That number increases all the time, too. So it's not surprising that these numbers should be increasing, given that all of the pillars of American society are saying one thing and only one thing about all of these subjects. Now, does this reflect a genuine change in thinking, or does this reflect a prudence on the part of Americans who know that they will be punished if they say certain things, even if they think that their answers are being held in confidence by a poll taker? I think there's probably a little bit of both. When you look, for example, at the number of white people who marry outside their race, in the 1960s, it was only about 1%. Now, about 10% of white people marry someone who is not a white person. Mostly they tend to marry Asians and Hispanics, but there's a certain number that marry blacks as well. This has been something utterly unthinkable throughout the United States for the most part of American history. There have been real changes in the way American people think. And as you point out, if you tell them over and over again that 2 + 2 = 5, there are some who are going to believe that. And in some cases, a large number will believe that if they are told repeatedly. And at the same time, as has happened to me and Stefan Molyneux and to many, many people who talk sense about these things, we are kicked off of YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and can't process our payments through PayPal. The other side has tried very, very hard to silence us, and in many respects that they've succeeded. I sometimes fantasize about the influence we would have and the size that our audiences would be if we had not been shadow banned and then, in fact, actually banned the way we have. But these are the circumstances we have to work with. Our advantage, of course, is that what we say is correct and what they say is wrong. And I like to think that the truth will ultimately triumph.
I hope too. One last question. Hollywood and pop culture have obviously had this immense influence on white Americans' minds. Obviously, is there any possibility to reverse that or to build a lateral brainwashing machine that would create an equilibrium of some sort?
Well, it would be very difficult to come up with anything that could compete with Hollywood. Hollywood is enormously well-financed. It has a distribution system, and it has very talented people. The people who are behind the camera, the people in front of the camera, the people who write the scripts. Even if you are watching a movie with a clearly anti-white message, often it's done in a very engaging way. The plot is well scripted. The actors act well. You can be drawn into something that you know very well is poison. It would be very, very hard to compete against that. Of course, what we are doing at this very moment is trying to come up with some corrective, some antidote to the poisons that are constantly being pumped into the minds and hearts and brains and living rooms of Americans and increasingly Europeans all around the world. So I consider that my job, and that's been my job for the last 30 years, is try to speak the truth. I don't consider it brainwashing because what we are talking about is true. As I said before, our view of race is one that I think is in perfect conformity with everything we know about history and human nature and how the genetics that underlie human differences. We're right and they're wrong. And we are in the grip of, again, a form of widespread insanity in which a mistaken view is the prevailing one. Not only is it prevailing, the people who propagate this view have the power to at least try very hard and in some cases succeed in silencing those of us who have the truth. So yes, we are all in the process of fighting back against that. Now, there are many people who point out that the arts are almost exclusively in the hands of people who are opposed to us. And that is true. And for that reason, I can't tell you how many people have sent me manuscripts of novels that are supposed to be correctives. Well, Novelists are born. And just because you have a political view does not mean that you can write a good novel. What we need, of course, are talented novelists who can convey a certain point of view with the kind of genius that they bring to the storytelling of their non-racially oriented novels. I think that Jean Raspail, the author of Camp of the Saints, he was a man of great literary talent and great prominence. And he wrote a novel that's been very effective. But the ones that I've seen, they're really people. If I sat down to try to write a novel that was to convey a racial point of view, it would probably be a very bad novel. And that is the general effect. And this is a reflection of several things. One, the number of people who are on the other side and the number of people who are on our side. There are not that many of us. The other is the forces of distribution. If you are a talented novelist, even if you think the way we do, you know that a novel that has a subversive message is not going to get wide distribution. It's not going to be well reviewed. So it is in your interests to write a novel that is at least racially neutral, if not racially anti-white. All of these things are conspiring against us. I would add that I think it is a mistake to set out deliberately to write a pro-white novel. That's almost bound to be a failure. And if we are to look at some of the great novelists of the past, if you were to read Anthony Trollope, for example, or Jack London, you will find that there's a healthy understanding of race that works its way through these novels without their novels being preachy in any obvious way. A book like Beau Geste, for example, by Percival Wren, it's about the British who join up with the French Foreign Legion and their adventures in North Africa. It's filled with a consciousness of race, but it's not the main message. It's an adventure story, and it's a good adventure story. But race is in the background in a healthy way. That is the kind of novel we need. I don't know of any novelist or movie maker who has the talent and the means to put together productions, creations of that kind. Someday, perhaps we will be there. But for those of us who really want to educate people by means of fiction, there are many good things from the past. Practically anything written 100 years ago is going to have a racial message that is healthy. It's going to be a subtle message, but it's going to be a healthy one.
One really last question, because I saw the viewers comment on this topic, and I'm not really well informed about it. I really didn't know about this party. Mike Enoch's National Justice Party. Do you have an opinion about it?
No, I can't say that I do. I'm aware of its establishment, and I hope that they succeed in getting candidates to run for office who take healthy and intelligent positions on things. But I don't have any inside information about that party, I'm sorry to say.
Neither did I know anything about it. So sadly, viewers, we don't have any information about it. Mr. Jared Taylor, it was a great honor once again. I hope in the future we will meet again. I hope when we meet the next time, Donald Trump will still be president.
I hope so too. Well, after September of next year, I hope to be able to visit Europe. And I have spent very little time in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland, and also in Estonia and in Lithuania. Those are I was in Russia also for a while. I would love to visit some of the states, the former Yugoslavia, where you live, all very fascinating and interesting to me. So I hope that we will have an opportunity to meet in person, but it probably will not be until after September of next year. But I look forward to that.
Probably not. You will come, okay, maybe through Skanza Forum and through the media. You will come to Zagreb even before your Schengen ban is put away. But we have coronavirus now.
Yes.
But when corona epidemics goes away, then we will certainly do whatever is in our power to invite you to Slovenia.
Well, that would be a great pleasure. I would love to visit Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and have a nice day. It is evening with us in Slovenia, and for all the viewers, thanks for watching. Thanks for all the commentaries. Have a nice day. Thank you once again.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.